I want to tell a story that changed my worldview and perception of the surrounding forever. All my ideas about the world turned out to be wrong. And the most interesting thing is that everyone could be in my place, regardless of gender, age, and religion. Let's talk about everything in order. My name is Maxim. I am a student of one of the colleges of our small town. In a year, I have to defend my thesis and graduate. I was not at all frightened by the responsibility and the imminent graduation, because I am already accustomed to adult and independent life. My parents died in a car accident a few years ago, and I had no other close relatives. My grandparents left this world when I was a child. I inherited from them a house in the village, which was not far from the city, but I did not appear there often, because it was much more convenient to live in a two-room parental apartment, and to get to college from here was much closer. In general, for several years I was left to my own devices, so I had the skills that made it possible for me to successfully cope with all my duties without help. I'm not going to lie. At times I was sad, because it's hard to realize that you are on your own and no one cares about you. But eventually, you get used to it. Apart from the loss of my relatives, I was no different from my peers. I studied, worked part-time, had fun, and relaxed as much as I could. But all of that until one moment. I was coming home from college one day. That day we had 5 pairs, so we finished studying in the evening. Of course it was dark outside, it was winter, so it was getting dark early. As already mentioned, the town is small and surrounded by forests. The college is just next to the forest area. The road from it to my house takes about 30 minutes. I was always faced with the choice of which way to go home. There were 2 options, either through the field, as I always went, or through the garage cooperative. I don't know why, but that night I decided to go through the garage. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I was a very wary person, so I never plugged in both headphones at once in places where something could go wrong. As I listened to the music, I walked down the path and thought about my own thoughts, not paying attention to my surroundings. I was brought out of my thoughts by a strange sound that came from an old abandoned garage that had long since collapsed. Half destroyed and unused, it had become a haven for homeless people and stray dogs. The sound itself was like some kind of slurping mixed with the rustling of debris and garbage. I still don't know why or for what purpose I decided to turn on the flashlight on my phone and shine it there. While my heart was beating at the speed of light, I stood there and watched as something rather large tore the poor mongrel to pieces. Meat and fur flew in all directions, and whatever was sitting there was quickly shoveling the pieces into its mouth. It was something very much like a man, but at the same time you could see the differences. The creature had long arms with large hands. The huge claws seemed to be extensions of the fingers. It was completely naked, with a bald head and overly large black eyes that reflected the light of the flashlight. I might have stood there until I was unconscious if the thing sitting in the garage hadn't raised its head and stared at me. It was covered in blood all over its face. Crimson streams dripped down from his chin to the ground, and in some places bits of flesh from the dead dog stuck to his face. Adrenaline had done its job and brought me out of the deepest shock. I sped off at such a speed that a panther or a cheetah would have stood on its hind legs, scratching its head in amazement. I didn't do sports or any special physical activity, but at that moment I didn't feel the hardness of the ground and tiredness of my legs. Only the horse's breathlessness made itself felt. But I could not stop, because the hideous monster ran after me, not giving way in speed. Most of the time, it moved on 2 legs like a normal human, but at times it fell on its front legs and galloped with great leaps. Surprisingly, I remember everything that happened then very well. I tried not to be in the creature's field of vision, so that it would lose me. Once again, I ran behind some bushes and fell into a small hole. As I fell, I hit my foot hard, and I was also covered with a bit of earth. This helped me to escape the fate of that poor animal, for the creature could not see me in such darkness and ran on. It was nearing summer. but it was still cool to lie on the damp ground. I was afraid to move or even take a deep breath because I was afraid it was near. As I curled up, I didn't notice that I had fallen asleep. When I opened my eyes, I felt a slight tremor in my body and pain in my eyes. A bright light hit me in the face along with small gusts of wind. It wasn't so scary anymore since it had been a long time and it was already light. I tried to stand up, but my stiff body refused to obey me. I got up and looked around me, but my stiff body refused to obey me. Everything was quiet and still, so I decided it was time to get out and go home. As I was about to head toward the residential sector, I had a rather bad thought. I thought that maybe I should go back to that garage to see if it was real. On the one hand, it was scary, but on the other, I was just really hoping I wouldn't see anything there. Then I would write it off as just falling into a hole on the way home and hitting my head. But unfortunately, when I got back, I saw the same thing I saw yesterday. An abandoned garage, the inside smeared with the blood and entrails of a stray dog. I threw up, and for another 5 minutes I just stood there, trying to process what had happened. When I felt a little better, I decided it was time to go home. But I didn't want to go further through the garages, because the creature had run that way. I had to walk a long way to get to the field, and then through it to my home. As soon as I crossed the threshold of my apartment, all my remaining strength left me. Despite the desire to eat, I could only fall on the bed and fall into a deep sleep. Thankfully, my infrequent absences from college were being overlooked, so I made the decision to stay home that day. Upon waking up, I immediately looked at the clock. It was already 5:30 in the evening. It was amazing how I had managed to sleep for so long. Anyway, when I got out of bed, I felt weak and sore, as if I had been trained by Schwarzenegger himself yesterday. On top of that, I had lost my cell phone, probably while running away from the creature. It wasn't until after dinner that I started to think about what had happened. Who was it? Was I really witnessing some kind of mystery? I can't believe it. And if I tell anyone, they'll say I'm crazy. Maybe just some crazy homeless guy caught a street dog so he wouldn't starve to death. All attempts to convince myself that there was a reasonable explanation failed when I remembered the creature's appearance. It was truly enormous, about 3 meters tall, and its long arms, too, were probably forever etched in my memory. At this rate, I'm going to go insane very soon. I'll have to look for something like it on the internet. I don't have any other options. I spent the rest of the evening in an almost pointless search for information. There were all sorts of things, stories about Reiki, chupacabras, aliens, and so on. All of it was nothing more than just scary stories for kids. Even if there was something useful there, I would not have been able to find it in the huge mass of entertaining content. But when I was about to close my laptop, I came across one article that managed to catch my attention with its headline, "Hide Before He Gets You." My first thought was that it was just another scary story or something, but I opened the page and started reading. It talked about some creatures called masked men. They got their nickname because of their ability to take the form of dead people. They have existed since ancient times and prefer not to be seen in public, but it would be unlucky for a person to meet one of them. By any means necessary, the masked man will try to find him and take his life. Moving on to the characteristic features of these creatures, I involuntarily shuddered. A large, disproportionate body compared to a human, huge black eyes, a bald head, and unnaturally large hands. It looked very much like the creature I had encountered the day before. But I refused to believe it, thinking that I was reading another creepypasta. But going to the page of the author of this writing, I did not see any more works, and the last time he went online was on the same day that this article was written. This seemed a little strange to me. In fact, it was easier to just forget about what had happened, because no one would give me accurate information and explanations, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life thinking about the existence of something inexplicable. I convinced myself that there was a logical explanation for everything, and maybe it wasn't like that at all. It was already dark outside, and I was tired after the steamy day, and I'd taken a hell of a path, and I'd hit my head when I'd fallen into the pit. It was definitely a vision, what's to guess? When I came to this conclusion, I felt much better at once. My mood lifted, and I wanted to do something, because lately, I had only been sleeping. I contacted an old acquaintance and offered him a walk, and he agreed without a second thought. We weren't friends, but we met from time to time and talked about things, gossiped and exchanged news. When I got home, I took a hot shower and sat in it for about an hour. Then I had a big dinner, and realizing that I didn't feel like sleeping, I decided to watch a movie. Some comedy that had just come out entertained me until a light knock came to my ears. It was a knock on the front door. It was too faint, as if someone was afraid to miscalculate the force and leave knuckle dents on the door. That's what I thought at the time. I carefully and cautiously approached the peephole, because I rarely had anyone coming in during the daytime, and at night I don't even talk about it at all. I looked through the peephole and saw absolutely nothing. The bulb had burned out again, which meant that I would have to buy and put it in. In our two-story house, besides me, there were only pensioners. I never saw anyone under 60 in the yard. On the one hand, it is not very comfortable, but on the other hand, in such an elderly neighborhood, no one will turn on music at night. There are no screaming, nasty children and all sorts of gopota. Still, there were more pluses than minuses. Even though the knocking continued, I didn't dare to open the door to anyone I didn't know. Bending down to the level of the upper door lock, I leaned my ear to hear some sounds, or maybe voices. After standing like that for about 2 minutes, I could only distinguish heavy breathing, like the wheezing of a tuberculosis patient, and rustling noises, as if the person behind the door were shifting from one foot to the other. Just in case, I tried not to make too much noise, and even breathed with my mouth open, so that it would be less audible. Soon there were footsteps outside the door, traveling down the stairs. The overnight guest had left the entryway. Unfortunately for me, the windows of my apartment faced the opposite side, so I couldn't see who was knocking on my door. In the morning when I woke up, the first thing I did was to remember why and wherefore I woke up during the night, because my condition left much to be desired. I didn't get any sleep at all, and lying down was not an option, because I wouldn't be able to sleep anyway. I decided to pour myself a warm bath and soak in it for an hour or two. I wouldn't drag it out. The day was quite normal, except that I had a fever and a sore throat, so I'd have to skip a week of school and stay home. Without doing anything useful, I went to bed quite early. It wasn't even 10 o'clock yet. Probably, because of the illness, all my strength had left me, and all I could do was sleep, sleep, and sleep again. Again, for the second night in a row, I was brought out of sleep by some strange sound. It was not hard to guess that, like that time, it came from the stairwell. It was a scraping sound, and the closer I got to the door, the more I realized that someone was scratching it on the other side with something sharp. I was about to run out onto the landing and see what was going on, but with my hand already on the lock, I stopped. My mind flashed back to the recent events I'd been trying my best to forget. It was enough to make me move a couple of meters away from the front door and freeze in place. In that sepulchral silence, absolutely everything was audible, and my footsteps included. Whoever was standing on the landing was obviously not satisfied with the fact that the door had not been opened for him and kicked it as hard as he could. My heart was pounding at a furious rate until I heard the door slam again. It was 5:30 in the morning, and I decided I wasn't going back to bed. When it dawned outside and the entryway was well lit with sunlight, I went out to see what my door now looked like from the outside. I'll say in advance that I didn't see anything good out there. I had a nice, not particularly old oak door, and now it had the words, "You can't hide," scratched into it. It's hard for me to describe that state of mind. You just have to imagine yourself in my place. You don't have to be particularly gifted to connect all these events. I understood who those scratches belonged to. Opening my laptop and reading the article about some masked men again, I banged my head on the table and laughed nervously. This seemed too funny. All my life I had been 100% sure I understood how and what worked. Humans came from monkeys, the church was a money-making project, and all psychics and sorcerers were assholes and clowns. Even after everything I had seen, it was hard for me to believe that everything was really wrong. But I believed my eyes and my mind. It was scary, but I decided to act decisively. While it was still light outside, I went to the store and bought a month's worth of groceries. I had to leave a good portion of my scholarship. After I got back, I spent the rest of my day at the apartment. My house is my fortress, so I decided to replace the front door with a newer and stronger one. Having chosen the thickest and with a lot of locks, I called the master to install it for me on the same day. It took him almost until the evening, but I was satisfied with the result. In place of the old oak door, there was a black metal door with 3 strong locks. I felt like I was in a bunker. I also decided that from now on, no matter what time it was, my thick curtains would be closed so that no window on the street could see what was going on in my apartment. At college, I told them I was on sick leave. I'll think about the certificate later. I have more important things to do now. It was getting pretty late, but I was still sitting at my laptop reviewing the highlights of that article. Maybe after a while it would forget about me or find another victim. But unfortunately, I was wrong. Earlier, I mentioned that I lost my phone when I was rescuing myself. It played a real trick on me. That creature found it. Surprisingly, it turned out to be quite intelligent. Of course, I could have guessed that before, but now I was finally convinced that it had a mind. And all because different letters and messages started coming to my mail, messengers and so on. All of them were similar to each other and contained invitations to various meetings and events. It was said that I was the winner in a contest, in which I did not even participate, and it was necessary to take the prize to the address. When I typed the address into the navigator, it turned out that there was an abandoned country factory there. And it was like this every time. The creature couldn't get into my apartment and decided to take it on the sly, but it was all too obvious. I had to constantly block left accounts and pages from which I received messages. In an instant, it was over. I was able to sleep well for a few nights because there was no spam or nightly knocks on the door. Then I was foolishly glad that it had left me alone. But the creature was not going to give up. It became clear after the next events. When I was already sweetly asleep and had my 10th dream, I was awakened again by sounds coming from the corridor. It was as if someone didn't dare to knock and only tried to do so by lightly touching the door. I have an overly sensitive sleeper, so any little thing makes me wake up, which I never like. Slipping my feet into my slippers, I carefully began to approach. Despite a few days of calm, I still couldn't completely relax, for I guessed what was behind the door right now. When I looked through the peephole, I didn't expect to see anything, for it was always dark in the entryway because of the lack of light bulbs, but this time the stairwell was dimly lit by a flickering light. Outside the door I saw Uncle Tolya. He was a man in his 50s who lived in the apartment directly across the hall from me. He was the only neighbor with whom I had any contact. The old man wasn't completely out of his mind, so there was a lot to talk about. I looked him over carefully, trying to figure out why he was so late. I had no idea what he wanted at this hour. Something about him didn't seem right. It felt like some detail had changed, but because I'd just woken up, I couldn't figure out what it was. He stood a meter away from the door, knocking on it periodically, and then started ringing the bell. It seemed that Uncle Tolya had been drinking, because he looked retarded to say the least. With his head slightly down, he turned it slightly from right to left, as if by such a gesture he was trying to depict a refusal of something. In addition to this, he did not stand still. At first, he waddled from foot to foot like a clumsy bear, and then he began to walk in circles around the playground, stopping to ring the bell. I stood there and couldn't figure out what was going on. I wondered if he'd had so much to drink that he'd decided to drop by my place late at night. Maybe he wanted to ask for money for beer or a snack, I thought. But I immediately dismissed the thought, because at this time they don't sell alcohol anywhere. so I would have watched my neighbor, if not for one moment. My foot itched sharply, and I waved it away, swiping my slipper on the floor. Immediately, I bit my lip and squeezed my eyes shut, for I could hear it from outside the door. Uncle Tolia stopped and, raising his head, began to knock on the door with more force and persistence. When he did, I realized what was wrong. For as long as I had known him, my grandfather had been squinted in one eye. He'd told me that he'd been in a car accident as a child and had spent his whole life with failing eyesight. But now he was fine, looking at the door with a perfectly normal gaze. His eyes were some kind of cloudy dark color, like tar. Then I remembered them. Those eyes and that look filled with inhuman malice. Everything fell into place. At that moment, my body felt a huge adrenaline rush, and to the frantic pounding on the door, I dialed the police. I didn't care what they would think or what I would tell them. The main thing now was to get them to the scene as quickly as possible. Almost immediately after that, the banging stopped, and there were quick footsteps, followed by the slamming of a neighbor's door. I was incredibly creeped out by the fact that the monster had not left, but was hiding in the neighbor's apartment. By the way, I no longer hoped that he would be found alive. For those 20 minutes, everything was like a fog. I came to my senses when the police knocked on my apartment. I told them that a psychopath had been following me for a long time, and that he had run into the apartment across the hall. They went there in a flash, pulling their guns out of their holsters. The next seconds of my life were more horrible than any nightmare I had experienced in my not-so-long life. It took me a while to realize what was going on. One of the cops ran out of the apartment and started throwing up. He was gurgling as hard as if a fire hydrant had burst. Soon the second policeman, dazed by something, came out and asked me to go with him to the apartment. I didn't want to go in there. I couldn't imagine what they could see there that was so horrible. Judging by their reaction, it was something that would make even a baby's hair turn gray if he witnessed it. But I had no choice but to go in. After only a split second of seeing the nightmare that was going on in there, I repeated the fate of the first policeman and poured the contents of my stomach into the apartment for about 10 minutes. Then my eyes went black and my limbs shook. I could no longer stand, so I had to sit down, leaning against the wall. The two policemen had already come to their senses and were examining the apartment. It was unacceptable for them to let their emotions get the better of them and panic. There was a broken window in the room, so the creature must have gotten out through it. But the problem was that right next to the window was a familiar mass. It was human skin. It was spread out on the floor like a large sleeping bag or a rag. In a single heap lay my neighbor's skin. I cried and became hysterical with fear and pity. I felt unbearably sorry for poor Uncle Tolia because he had done nothing bad to anyone, even on the contrary. And in return for his good nature and big heart, the monster had completely skinned him. There was no body anywhere, no more trace of the old man or the creature. I realized that it was on the loose and would not stop until it got to me. I won't describe how I was dragged through the precincts, interrogations, and so on. I was glad, because I felt safe among people with guns. I begged to be locked up and guarded, but the police had no such authority, for I was innocent. They started an investigation, of course, but it's hardly helpful. It won't let itself be caught because its purpose is unfulfilled. I am still at large and aware of its existence. In a flash, I made up my mind to leave town. Fortunately, the house in the village, inherited from my grandmother, allowed me to do so. I hastily packed the necessities of life, took the intercity bus, and left the place. If the budget had allowed me to go somewhere farther away, I would have gladly done it, but alas. Again, there is no point in telling how I got there, because nothing interesting was happening at that time. The cottage, as expected, was overgrown with grass on the outside and a huge layer of dust and cobwebs on the inside. There was no one to take care of it. I didn't know my neighbors, for I was rarely in these parts. As I settled down, I relaxed a little and breathed. I had an imaginary feeling that I was safe, and that it was impossible to find me here. But as it turned out, it was all just an illusion. I don't know how, by smell, by intuition, or by the stars, this thing found me. But the fact remains. Half a week after I arrived in the village, a girl in her 20s disappeared. I found out about it when her relatives came to my house to ask if I knew anything. They went all over the village but did not get any information. Even then, I guessed who was to blame for all this, but I really wanted to believe otherwise. Anyway, there was nowhere to go and no point in running. If it found me here, it would find me anywhere else. I sank into a state of depression and apathy. I didn't feel like eating or drinking. I realized that I was unlikely to live another week. There were many icons and crosses in my grandmother's house, holy water in the cupboard, and a Bible on the table. But did it even matter? Not that all this junk would really help me. If there is a God, why does he allow such terrible things to happen? Why doesn't he prevent all cruelty until you cry out to him for help? And who says that if there is evil in the world, there must necessarily be good? This myth has been inspired by pop culture, books, movies, and so on. In fact, I believe that such a world may well consist of pure, inherently evil. Perhaps in this universe evil has triumphed, and now nothing can prevent it. Who knows? In such heavy and frankly useless reflections, I fell asleep. I had bad dreams. The kind of dreams that a person with a fever or schizophrenia usually has. But in the morning I mostly forgot their content. Only unpleasant sensations remained. I'll say in advance that it was day X. But in the early morning I didn't realize it yet. I wanted to go outside and breathe the cool, fresh air, and maybe my thoughts would come to order. The police were now hanging around the village too. I could tell by the blue and white beanbags belonging to the officers. When your life can be cut short any day, you start to look at things in a new way. The sun is no longer irritating with tingling in the eyes, but on the contrary, warms and pleasantly illuminates the space around. The wind does not tear your clothes with powerful gusts, but lightly blows your body. It is the same with everything else. You look at people, animals, some habitual things that seemed routine before. Until the evening, I philosophized on the porch of my house. At some point, a sound came to my ears. It was not a particularly pleasant, plodding voice. It was calling for help, barely audible over the gusts of wind. As I walked around the property, I realized it was coming from the woods behind my house, about 50 meters away. It was already dark outside to see anything from that distance. The thought occurred to me that it could be the missing girl. Perhaps she had gotten lost and was just now making her way out toward the village, or maybe I was just imagining things. I decided that I should get my grandfather's old lantern and shine it into the woods to see something. Taking the device, I went out to the backyard and began to move the beam of the lantern from side to side, trying to catch something interesting. I succeeded. Behind one of the trees, I noticed a figure, or rather a part of it. It was a young girl standing behind the tree and peering out from behind it. She was looking exactly in my direction. It was clearly visible. Why is she hiding there? She's not normal at all, I thought. Having shouted a couple of times to her to come here, I was about to move in her direction, but something stopped me. Again, it all seemed strange. It wasn't that the girl was alone in the forest at this hour and didn't want to come out. It was the fact that I couldn't see her body completely. Looking even closer, I thought there was something wrong with her head. It was tilting unnaturally backwards like some kind of doll. I started to get annoyed with this game of hide and seek, so I yelled that if she didn't come out, I was going to call the police right now. A second later, I regretted my words. Straightening up from behind the tree was the familiar figure of the monster, which had previously bent almost double. In one hand, it held the girl's body, or rather her half. There were no legs. Everything ended at the waist. The creature held her like a puppeteer, as if she were a toy, and with its other hand it waved at me in a friendly manner, as if to say that here we met. I dropped the lantern to the ground and rushed into the house, locking the door with all my might. Half a minute later, there was a light knock on the door. The creature was obviously trying to play with me, and I was ready for it. A few seconds later, it began to run around the house, and with such speed that Lightning McQueen nervously smokes in the side. Meanwhile, I'd already figured out what I was going to do. There were some gas cans in one of the rooms. Grandpa kept them here to fill up his old clunker. When asked why he didn't put them in the barn, Grandpa said that when he didn't have the energy to stoke the furnace, he'd put a little fuel in and the fire would start by itself. My plan was to pour gasoline all over the house, lure the monster in, and then set it on fire, leaving its body to smolder in the embers for a long time. That would be fine, but I couldn't find anything to set it on fire with. Frantically rummaging through the kitchen drawers, I looked for a lighter, or at least matches, but the footsteps outside the window had gone silent. Looking out the window, I saw the monster's monstrous face, which with a satisfied grin drove its huge claws on the glass. Finally, I found a box that held a couple of matches. I could only hope that they were not damp and could be lit, or I would die a horribly painful death in a few minutes. In the meantime, the vile creature started banging on the window, letting me know that it still hadn't gone anywhere. The pounding was light at first, and then increased and increased, until the window shattered from the powerful blows. It toppled over the window opening and tore toward me, squelching through the gasoline and rinsing its body in it more and more. I was already standing at the front door, preparing to throw a lit match. When it was about 3 meters away from me, I did so, throwing the entire box onto the floor, then slammed the door shut with my whole body against it. Immediately, the creature screamed loudly, turning to shrieks in places. It was roasting alive, which I was glad of. Soon it was quiet, and the house was almost completely engulfed in flames. By the time the firemen arrived and started putting out the cabin, I had already made up a legend that I had been smoking in the house and had accidentally set the curtain on fire. What they would find at the scene of the fire was of no concern to me. By morning, I was back at the station to determine the cause of the fire and obtain paperwork. I can say that my life started to get better from then on. I had a long time to deal with all sorts of papers and documents. I had to restore my burned passport, policy, and so on. I returned to the city, to my home apartment. I swore to myself that I would forget everything that had happened and live a new life. So it all worked out. I went to school again, met with an acquaintance, and even met a girl. Hopefully we'll be fine. The only thing that changed dramatically in my life was my attitude towards church. Now I attended it every week, prayed, and donated money to the temples. I don't know if that makes sense, but it makes me feel better. Now I live with the belief that I am doing the right thing, and those terrible events will never happen to me again. I want to give advice that may save someone's life one day. If you find yourself in the same situation as me, then do not waste time. Do not run and hide. None of that makes sense. You have to take this fight face to face, and I hope you can come out of it victorious.